Beneath the ancient oaks of St. Michael's Cemetery in Charleston, 9 headstones sit in a neat, respectable row, names etched in marble that once opened every grand door in the city. Between 1851 and 1855, each man died the same way if the doctors were to be believed. Sudden paralysis, a merciful end that spared the family spectacle. The matter was delicate, the whispers soft, and Charleston moved on. Then in 1923, the earth gave up its secret. Renovation crews lifted the lids of the old coffins and froze. Fingernail grooves raked the undersides of the planks. Limbs were twisted, jaws clenched. The dead arranged as if they had awakened in darkness and fought until the air ran out. City officials sealed the findings within hours, the records buried as neatly as the bodies had been. What the city could not bury lay just yards away, under the spreading shade of the oldest Magnolia. A leather-bound notebook, preserved by the soil and time, written in a careful, educated hand. Solomon Fairfax. It was not a diary. It was a ledger of patience and punishment. The first entry carried a single sentence that explained everything. Today, as I watch my wife and children burn, and I did nothing to stop it. Charleston in the 1850s called itself civilized, white-columned mansions along the Cooper River, fortunes built on rice and cotton. A medical community proud of its learning and manners. Among its respected physicians stood Dr. Cornelius Hathaway, whose practice on Meeting Street glittered with instruments and clients from the highest tiers of society. His quiet advantage was the man who ran the back rooms with a healer's calm and a scholar's memory. Solomon Fairfax. Enslaved, tall and watchful, a botanist by inheritance and a chemist by necessity. Solomon did not arrive at Hathaway's doorstep by chance. He had lived 32 years on the Pemberton plantation, a husband to Celia, a father to 3, Marcus, Samuel, little Grace. He knew the marsh paths where fever grasses grew, the bark that dulled pain, the leaves that steadied a failing breath. When epidemics swept the quarters, people called for Solomon. When illness touched the big house, they called for him too. And then came March of 1851. Edmund Pemberton, debts high, options low, chose to sell assets that breathed and loved. Solomon begged, bargained, offered a lifetime of free labor to keep his family together. The answer was the same one Charleston had always given to such pleas: no. At dawn on March 14th, wagons rattled toward the Charleston slave market through rain-slashed ruts. Halfway to town, the wheel hit a cut in the road. Celia toppled, struck the ground, blood bright against the mud. The traders glanced, measured, and decided she was a loss. They drove on. At the market, the world came apart by ledger line. Marcus to the rice fields near Georgetown, where alligator water glinted between rows. Samuel sold upriver, into the red dirt and the cotton places where men were ground down by seasons. Grace, 4 years old, went to Savannah and vanished into parlors and back stairs. Solomon stood silent and breathing, which is the only rebellion the market allowed. Dr. Hathaway bought him that afternoon, hearing what other doctors had said. The man's hands were steady. His Latin was clean, his recipes reliable. Solomon looked back once at the market's timbered vaults, and then forward into a life that would require more patience than any fever he had fought. That night, in a narrow room above the Meeting Street practice, he opened his hidden journal and wrote the line that would steer the next 4 years of his life. He did not swear revenge with sputtering rage. He did not promise noise. He promised time. The city welcomed him as it welcomes competent invisibility. Patients, ladies with fainting spells, planters with gout and proud hearts, began to request the assistant. He was gentle, they said. He understood. He remembered. Dr. Hathaway, stiff with arthritis and softened by trust, let Solomon manage more and more, dosages, poultices, consultations for the usual complaints among the elite. Solomon learned as good students do. He learned the rhythms of Charleston's grand houses from scullery whispers. He learned the names of men who had stood laughing at the block when his children were sold. He learned the schedules of their ailments and the frailties of their bodies. He learned in the pages of the doctor's library how certain plants quieted muscles so completely that a body mimicked death while the mind remained awake, listening, feeling, waiting. A vine from the Amazon, cultivated by a proud Charleston botanist. A distillate that measured precisely would slow a pulse beyond detection and pin a breath to the thinnest thread. Too little. and the victim would recover with a story of dizziness. Too much, and the end would be merciful. Far too merciful for what Solomon intended. But the exact measure that delivered another kind of verdict. He perfected the extraction in a shed behind the practice, among jars labeled in Latin and ink. He tested and timed and took careful notes that read like a physician's casebook, because they were only inverted. His plan was not to heal the living, it was to educate the dead in terror. He chose Colonel Reginald Fitzpatrick first, a loud man with a weak heart, famous for gout and for the jokes he told at auctions. Fitzpatrick came alone to his appointments. His servants feared him. His death, when it came, would be easily chalked up to faulty flesh. On a December afternoon in 1852, the colonel swallowed a familiar draught mixed by familiar hands. The paralysis came softly, like a gentleman's coat laid over sleeping shoulders. Solomon sat close and introduced himself, not as boy, not as assistant, but as Solomon Fairfax, the man the colonel had laughed at while children were priced for breeding. He explained, gently and clinically, what would happen next. The doctor would misread the signs. A coffin would be prepared, earth would drum the lid, and only then would time run out. When Dr. Hathaway entered, he found a body that fit the chart. A known heart finally failed. The funeral came, the coffin lowered, the shovels went to work. Respectable men removed their hats, and no one asked what the dead man could still hear. That night the journal gained a second entry. 1. Justice is patient. Charleston continued outwardly as it always had. Teas poured. Contracts drafted, sermons preached, but beneath its rituals a quiet thread had been pulled. The city did not feel it yet. Solomon did. He understood what patience could do to a system built on the certainty that the people it crushed would never reach back. This is where the story truly begins, with 9 graves that looked like peace, a city that preferred not to look too closely, and a healer who decided that if the law would not measure justice, chemistry would. The winter after Colonel Fitzpatrick's funeral arrived as a thin, salt-cold wind that slipped up the Cooper and rattled palmetto fronds against shuttered windows. Charleston wore mourning well. The city was practiced at it. Black crape draped over brass knockers, pews filled with quiet sobs and measured eulogies, physicians speaking in Latin-laced euphemisms about hearts that relented and vessels that failed. No one asked what a man might still hear inside a sealed box. Solomon listened instead. He listened to the cramped breath of the old city as it congratulated itself on civility. He listened to gossip that passed between kitchens like contraband, who had fallen, who had fainted, who had started sleeping with a lamp lit through the night. He tended to compresses, counted powders into paper folds, and marked with a calm pen the men whose signatures had once bound his children to strangers. Among those names, one had a courtroom's weight, Judge Marcus Calverton. Calverton's chambers smelled of ink and laudanum. He was a respected man, which in Charleston meant he had the voice to call cruelty order. For 2 years his skull had throbbed with lightning that began behind his eyes and marched to the base of his neck, migraines that left him vomiting into silver bowls while his clerk whispered appointments through the door. He came often to Dr. Hathaway's practice, hat brim low, dignity fraying. He often asked for the assistant who knew just how tightly to draw the bandage and exactly how long to let the cool cloth rest on a brow before it became cruel with cold. Solomon's notes on Calverton read like the list of particulars. Before sentences passed, age late 60s, presenting apoplexy and family line, migraines weekly. Habits, rich sources, rich port, richer certainty. Past, wrote the opinion that upheld the separation of slave families as economically necessary. Quoted scripture when he signed children away. Calverton would die believably. That mattered. Solomon's education had taught him that justice, to survive, must look like nature. He refined the dose again, small adjustments measured with a watchmaker's caution, then waited for the appointment that would look like any other. A soft morning in April arrived with the scent of wisteria and rot. The judge stepped into the exam room, his eyes pinched shut against the light. "Assistant," he murmured, one hand groping for the chair's arm. "Your cloth." "Of course, sir," Solomon said, steady and respectful, the voice Charleston had trained into him. He folded the linen over cool water, wrung it precisely, and set out the draught Dr. Hathaway had prescribed many times before, bitter bark, a whisper of opiate, and from Solomon's hand alone, 1 drop more than intended. The mistake was smaller than a raindrop. It was enough. Within minutes, Judge Calverton's breath shortened in the peculiar way Solomon knew to watch for, the shallow rise and fall that mimicked sleep while the eyes remained too bright. The hands stiffened, not like death but like a violin string drawn taut. Solomon leaned close so that when he spoke, the words would reach the ear clearly, even if the body could not show it had heard. "My name," he said gently, "is Solomon Fairfax. You argued that money made family a luxury. I am here to teach you the cost." Then the door opened and the ritual resumed. Dr. Hathaway strode in with his habitual soft clatter of instruments. He examined, frowned, examined again. "Curious," the doctor said, thumb at the judge's wrist. "Rigidity. Earlier than expected for stroke. The eyes, do you see? Something like dread." Solomon's face held the right sorrow. "He complained of light, doctor." The pain came quickly. Hathaway's brow knit. He was not a fool. He was a man of his century. He touched, he timed, he listened with a stethoscope that echoed only his own anxiety. After a laborious quarter hour that stretched Solomon's nerves like wire, the doctor sighed and found a sentence that fit the city. Apoplexy, severe. Poor man. He must have suffered. He had. He still was. Arrangements began as arrangements did. The clerk notified, the widow sent for, the undertaker calm and efficient as he measured the respectable dead. Solomon stepped back into the corridor, where ordinary life clicked into place. The rasp of a broom, the drip of a wash basin, the life of a street cart passing the window. He breathed once, deep and quiet, and wrote 2 lines in the mind-scored ledger he would later ink onto paper. 2. Pattern invisible. But Charleston's newspapers had begun to collect curiosities the way scholars collect beetles, pinned and labelled, set alongside counts and charts. And in the newsroom of the Charleston Mercury, a young reporter sat with a pile of obituaries and an unquiet feeling. Thomas Grimby did not yet have a reputation. He had a notebook and a pencil that always needed sharpening. On the margins of funeral notices, he wrote words that gentlemen preferred not to see next to their kin: frequency, cluster, improbability. Calverton made the 3rd unexpected passing among the city's most moneyed men in 6 months. Grimby's editor snorted. The city was old. Old men died. Grimby came to the funerals anyway. He watched who watched. He stood near the back, where the enslaved gathered in quiet rows and observed everything, because seeing everything gave you the smallest margin of safety. He noticed the assistant from Meeting Street standing among them, tall, composed, eyes that counted exits. He saw the way that man looked at the ground the way a surveyor does, as if calculating depth instead of distance. He wrote another note in his book. Assistant present? Meeting Street practice. He did not yet have a story. He had friction, the hot whisper when 2 facts rubbed together and refused to lie still. Back in the practice, the world tried to mend itself the way it always does, by moving forward. The waiting room filled. Bottles clinked as they were restocked. The doctor, troubled by something he could not name, proposed a solution that men like him always proposed when troubled: more doctors. Solomon, Hathaway said one evening, rubbing his stiff hands. "I'm considering taking on a junior partner, a bright young fellow, Philadelphia trained, modern methods. Henderson, his name. It would ease our load." Ease was the one thing Solomon could not afford. A northern-trained physician meant newer instruments and nosier curiosity. It meant someone who might hold a pulse longer, who might ask an unwelcome question about why a body that slept didn't breathe in the right rhythm, or why the pupils held light like a cat's at midnight. Patience had gotten him this far. Patience might lose him everything now. Solomon recalibrated. He understood gears and tolerances, the way one tooth slipping changes an entire clock. He had planned to spread the 9 lessons across years so that the city would forget the first before the last arrived. Now the line of graves must be drawn closer together. Accidents would begin to look like arrangement if he hurried. But if he did nothing, Henderson would arrive with new eyes, and the cupboard of justice would be closed and locked. The choice was cruel and simple. He chose speed. He turned his attention to a man whose death would not be kind to secrecy, Captain William Dandridge, shipowner, transporter of cargo along the same routes that carried sugar and cotton, and, on the return, the profits. Dandridge was hearty and inconveniently healthy. He did not frequent the practice. He drank at dinners and laughed about storms. Opportunity would not drift to Solomon on a tide. He would have to wade out and catch it. The kitchen network supplied the tide chart. In Charleston, as in every city that pretends secrets are safe, information traveled best in aprons. Martha, who ruled half the great house's stoves with a wooden spoon and an iron gaze, mentioned it while snapping beans behind the back steps of an East Bay mansion. A dinner at Dandridge's on May 20th, 1853. 12 men who measured fortunes by how much they could force into a hull. Absences in staff due to fever. Extra hands needed to serve the brandied dessert. Solomon offered his hands. He spent the week before the dinner refining a different method, absorption through drink and sweet. He practiced on slices of stale cake until the dose soaked evenly and left neither scent nor taste, only certainty. He rehearsed the calm he would wear as he moved in and out of a room full of men who thought his presence meant invisibility. On the afternoon of the dinner, he stood in Dandridge's kitchen beside Martha, who worked like a general. The army loved enough to obey. He listened to the dining room roar, cigar and salt, laughter and plans. He plated 12 portions and breathed once steadily, before touching a single plate with a brush the size of a moth's wing. Dandridge asked for seconds. The toxin took him gently by the elbow at first, a wobble mistaken for wine, a hand against the chair back, a mumbled line about the air. He excused himself to his study. There the softness hardened into iron. What happened next turned patience into exposure. The captain did not die quietly in a medically tidy room. He died in a house blazing with gaslight and nerve. Among his guests lounged a doctor, and then, because fear begets more opinions, 2 more arrived before midnight. The word poison landed on silvered ears and echoed, lustrous and dangerous. Thomas Grimby arrived before the lamps were lowered. He questioned a footman. He peered toward the kitchen. He found Martha, who told him nothing and everything at once by the way she didn't meet his eyes when he asked about the assistant from Meeting Street. In the ledger of risk, a new column had opened, witnesses. Solomon returned to Meeting Street before dawn and found the doctor already awake, reading the city's sudden concern in the stiff set of his mouth. Dandridge, Hathaway said. A seizure, they're calling it. Or worse, Solomon. He hesitated. We must be beyond reproach in the coming weeks. Yes, sir, Solomon said, the words smooth as polished wood. Beyond reproach was the difficult part. Beyond suspicion had already slipped his grasp. He opened the journal that night and wrote what he had not wanted to write. 3. The city is beginning to hear a pattern. On the other side of town, Grimby sharpened his pencil and drew lines between names. Fitzpatrick, Calverton, Dandridge. He wrote down the phrase that would become his private headline before any editor would risk printing it, the prominent deaths phenomenon. He underlined phenomenon twice. Then, in a smaller hand, Meeting Street assistant present at 2. At Dandridge's? Ask Martha again. Somewhere between those lines and Solomon's, the quiet city finally shifted. It was not yet panic. It was the first tiny click of a lock turning on its own. And somewhere under the Magnolia, decades later, when men in canvas caps dug where they were told not to, wooden lids would tell a story louder than any sermon. But for now it was May 1853, and Charleston still believed it could keep its dinner napkins white. The night of May 20th, 1853, settled over Charleston like a silk shroud, warm, perfumed, and heavy with the scent of river mud and magnolia. Inside Captain William Dandridge's mansion on East Bay Street, candles burned bright against the gathering dusk. 12 of Charleston's wealthiest merchants filled the dining room, their laughter rolling like the tide against the polished walls. They drank to profits, to safe voyages, and, though they would never say it aloud, to the trade that had built their fortunes, the buying and selling of human lives. In the kitchen below, Solomon Fairfax moved with quiet precision. His white serving gloves hid hands that trembled only when alone. Around him the orchestra of domestic labor played on. Martha barking orders, copper pots clanging, wine bottles uncorked. To every eye that glanced his way, Solomon was what they expected him to be: efficient, invisible, obedient. But his mind was elsewhere, on his children's laughter, on Celia's voice, on the sound of a wagon wheel splintering in the rain. Tonight was not about rage. Rage was noisy and clumsy. Tonight was about symmetry, the captain's last toast. The guests leaned back in their chairs as servants cleared the main course, roasted duck glazed in molasses and rum. Laughter echoed as Dandridge raised his glass. To Charleston's prosperity, he boomed, and to the ships that carry our fortune on every tide. The men cheered. Some slapped the table. Others nodded, already calculating their next voyage. In a corner, Solomon stood beside a silver tray of brandy-soaked desserts. Each portion had been meticulously prepared, but one had been touched by a careful brush, the faintest layer of his paralytic extract, invisible and tasteless, infused into the brandy that would soak the captain's final meal. He carried the tray to the table, setting each plate down with quiet grace. When he placed the captain's portion before him, their eyes met for the briefest instant. Dandridge smiled, oblivious, and lifted his fork. The toxin began its work within minutes. Dandridge's laughter softened, his speech slurred slightly, and a faint sheen of sweat formed along his temple. He excused himself with a chuckle. "Too much wine," he muttered. "Too much good company." Solomon watched him rise and walk unsteadily toward his private study. Then, when the door closed, he waited. The collapse 15 minutes later, the laughter from the dining room faltered. A servant ran in, breathless. "The captain, sir, he's fallen." Chairs scraped. The room erupted into confusion. Dr. Samuel Pettigrew, one of the guests, hurried to the study. Solomon followed silently, heart pounding. Dandridge sat slumped in his leather chair, eyes open, body rigid. The doctor checked his pulse, his breath, his pupils. "This is peculiar," he murmured. No sign of apoplexy. No convulsion marks. "The muscles," he frowned, touching the captain's arm. "They're stiff. Far too stiff," the guests murmured in horror. One whispered the word that would unravel everything: poison. Within the hour, 2 more physicians had been summoned. Each found the same puzzle, a body that appeared dead but not dead enough. Solomon stood near the doorway, his composure perfect, even as sweat gathered beneath his collar. He knew that the toxin in this dose left traces time could not yet disguise. By dawn, the story had spread across Charleston. The Charleston Mercury printed it by afternoon. Prominent ship captain dies suddenly. Poison suspected. A city. Begins to tremble for the first time. Solomon's patience failed him. He had wanted silence. 9 deaths like whispers, nothing loud enough to echo. But the dinner party made noise. It filled the air with suspicion and fear. The wealthy began glancing nervously at their servants. Doctors reviewed their ledgers and appointments with uneasy eyes, and somewhere, in the ink-stained newsroom of the Mercury, Thomas Grimby began to connect the dots. He drew lines between the recent deaths: Fitzpatrick, Calvert and Dandridge, men who had all profited from the Charleston slave trade, all treated at Dr. Hathaway's practice. In his private notes, Grimby wrote, "Assistant present at 2, possibly 3, educated slave, access to medicines." The city's veneer of gentility was cracking. Rumors whispered through back alleys and parlors alike. Some said the poisoner was a ghost, the spirit of vengeance for sins long buried. Others blamed rival merchants, a northern conspiracy or witchcraft from the islands. Solomon heard all of it, quietly amused. The irony was cruel. These men who denied his people the simplest humanity now feared an invisible intelligence they could not comprehend. The weight of consequence, Doctor. Hathaway summoned Solomon late one evening, worry deepening the lines around his mouth. "These deaths, Solomon. The papers are relentless. I find it troubling that all 3 were our patients." Solomon bowed his head. "The city's nerves, sir. Coincidence breeds gossip." "Perhaps," said Hathaway, though his voice lacked conviction. "Still, I'll be adding a partner soon. Dr. Henderson arrives from Philadelphia next month, young but thorough. His presence should ease these suspicions." For Solomon, the words fell like a verdict. A new doctor meant scrutiny, new eyes that would not overlook what the old had dismissed. He realized his time was running out. That night, in his candle-lit room, he opened his journal once more. 3 are gone. 6 remain. The city begins to listen, and I must teach faster. But another line followed, smaller, almost uncertain. I dream of their faces. Not the dead, the living. My children. I hear them calling from somewhere I cannot follow. The hunter draws. Near meanwhile, Thomas Grimby's curiosity hardened into obsession. He visited St. Michael's Cemetery, walking between the graves of Charleston's elite, making sketches of the newly dug earth. He began asking quiet questions in slave quarters, paying for information with coins and kindness. When he learned of Solomon's presence at the dinner, he wrote a single chilling sentence in his notebook. If the devil walks among us, he wears a healer's hands. He wasn't wrong. But he also wasn't ready for how much truth that sentence carried. The dinner had changed everything. The deaths were no longer isolated tragedies. They were a pattern, a story. And stories once told could not be buried again. As Charleston's society trembled under candlelight and rumor, Solomon worked alone behind Dr. Hathaway's office, mixing a fresh batch of his paralytic compound. Each measured drop gleamed like glass beneath the flame. His hand no longer shook. He had given his enemies fear. Now he would give them understanding. What he didn't know was that the man who would expose him, the journalist, who would one day write the final words of his legend, was already watching from the shadows outside. By June of 1853, Charleston no longer slept soundly. The laughter of the privileged still echoed through grand parlors, but it now carried an undercurrent of unease. The Mercury printed euphemisms for panic, a rash of untimely illnesses among the city's best families. Apothecaries locked their shelves, and society wives began to whisper that perhaps even faith could be poisoned. And in the quiet room above Dr. Hathaway's practice, Solomon Fairfax wrote by candlelight, his ink steady, his handwriting unnervingly calm. They call it illness. They call it chance. But chance has no patience and justice has no mercy. 3 men lay in St. Michael's Cemetery now, each in a coffin that sounded hollow if one pressed an ear to it. Solomon had perfected the art of silence, yet his work was unraveling beneath the weight of its own success. Thomas Grimby, the journalist, had begun publishing veiled accusations, calling attention to a mysterious healer whose presence seemed to shadow Charleston's dead. And Dr. Hathaway, increasingly uneasy, had written north to expedite the arrival of his young protege, Dr. Timothy Henderson, from Philadelphia. Solomon's time was dissolving like a drop of toxin in warm wine. The arrival of the modern Doctor. Henderson arrived in late May, clean-shaven, bespectacled and earnest, his medical bag stuffed with the latest instruments from the north, glass syringes, scalpels of fine steel, and a stethoscope with tubing that gleamed like polished rope. His speech carried the clipped precision of a man who believed science could explain everything. He was polite to Solomon, but distant. Behind every question lay suspicion. "You've been invaluable here, Mr. Fairfax," Henderson said one morning, glancing over the patient register. "Your skill is remarkable for your background." Solomon smiled faintly, his tone respectful. "One learns what necessity demands, sir." To Henderson, the words were humble. To Solomon, they were scripture. Within days, Henderson began re-examining cases, including those of Fitzpatrick, Calverton, and Dandridge. His notes were meticulous. His conclusions were cautious but dangerous, unusual rigidity in muscle tone, possible exposure to foreign compound. Source uncertain. Solomon read the entries when the young doctor left them unattended. He understood instantly. Henderson was too clever to be manipulated, too principled to be silenced. If Solomon were to complete his mission, he would need to act before modern medicine illuminated his darkness. And so, he conceived his most daring plan yet, one that would end not with a whisper, but with a room full of the guilty breathing in their own doom. The meeting of Henderson and associates, through his network of kitchen servants and porters, Solomon learned that 6 of Charleston's most influential traders, Harrison Vance, Elias Munro, Jonathan Cray, Samuel DeVoe, Thomas Abner, and Judge Lanton Price, were to convene at the offices of Henderson and Associates Shipping Company on the night of June 15, 1853. They intended to finalize a massive expansion of their slave operations, ships to Cuba, to New Orleans, to the Caribbean, where the trade still thrived beneath thin veils of legality. Their signatures, written that night, would condemn thousands more to bondage. Solomon had already marked their names in his journal beneath a single heading: the architects. For weeks, he studied the building from the shadows. Henderson and Associates used the city's newest innovation, gaslighting, fed by a central pipe system. To most, it was progress. To Solomon, it was a perfect delivery system. In the shed behind the practice, he began distilling his toxin into a vaporized form. He labored without rest, his hands blistered, his lungs burning from the fumes. At last he succeeded, a concentrated essence that could mix with the gaslight, spreading through air like perfume, silent, invisible, absolute. The night of June 15th that evening, the lamps along East Bay Street flickered with golden flame as the merchants arrived. One by one, their carriages lining the cobblestones. Solomon watched from the alley, his coat blending with the shadows. At 8 o'clock sharp, the gaslights in the office flared to life. From the window he saw their silhouettes, 6 men gesturing, laughing, pouring brandy. The signing began. Solomon waited exactly 30 minutes, then turned the valve he had installed in secret days earlier. A narrow puncture in the gas line, now feeding not just flame but death. Inside, conversation turned to coughing. Abner reached for his throat. Monroe's pen slipped from his hand. Vance, trying to stand, gripped the table until his knuckles went white. One by one they froze in place, statues of their own greed, eyes wide with disbelief as paralysis claimed them. Solomon entered through the back door using a duplicate key. The office was eerily quiet, save for the faint hiss of the lamps. 6 men sat around the mahogany table, exactly as they had been moments before, alive, aware but utterly helpless. He moved among them like a physician performing rounds, speaking softly as he examined their faces. "Gentlemen, you once purchased what you called property. Tonight you will understand what that word truly means." One tear slid down Judge Price's cheek. Monroe's eyes darted toward the door, pleading. "No one is coming," Solomon said gently. "Your voices are gone, your bodies no longer yours. You'll remain aware long enough to feel the soil close over you, as my wife and children felt the world closing over theirs." The witness, the sound of footsteps broke the silence. Solomon turned. Standing in the doorway, notebook in hand, was Thomas Grimby. The young journalist's face was pale, but his eyes burned with both horror and fascination. "So it's true," Grimby whispered. "The killer is no phantom." "It's you," Solomon regarded him calmly. "You've been following me for months. You already knew." Grimby hesitated, glancing at the 6 motionless men. Their eyes followed him like ghosts pleading for absolution. "What have you done to them?" "They are alive," Solomon said evenly. "For now. I've given them time to think, to remember, to know what it means to be powerless." Grimby's pen trembled. "You call this justice?" "I call it reflection," Solomon replied. "They built their fortunes on helplessness. I've simply given it back." Outside, the sound of approaching voices echoed. City constables, perhaps summoned by a passing clerk, who had noticed lights still burning at this late hour. Grimby's gaze flicked toward the noise, then back to Solomon. "You can still run," he said quietly. "I'll delay them." "You've proved your point." But Solomon shook his head. His mission was finished, amid the ledger nearly complete. "I've no wish to escape," he said. "Justice must be seen to exist, even if it dies with me." Grimby's throat tightened. For a long moment the 2 men, one with a pen, one with poison, stared at each other, bound by the same terrible understanding. They had both come seeking truth, and neither would leave untouched. When the door burst open, Charleston's constables found the impossible. 6 men alive but frozen in terror, and 1 slave standing beside them, serene and unresisting. The end of silence. Solomon surrendered without struggle. His confession, taken that night, filled 30 pages of police record. Every name, every method, every motive. He described his toxin's properties, the calculations, the patience. He did not ask for mercy. Outside, Charleston buzzed with scandal and disbelief. Some called him a monster. Others whispered his name in awe. The slave who had learned medicine to heal had turned his knowledge into retribution, and in doing so exposed the sickness at the heart of the South. For Grimby, the story became an obsession. He wrote by lamplight until dawn, his pen catching every detail. The stillness of the victims, the quiet pride in Solomon's eyes, the smell of magnolia through the open window. He closed his notebook with a shudder. "If hell exists," he wrote, It speaks softly, and its voice is that of a man who has been made to wait too long for justice. The arrest of Solomon Fairfax sent shockwaves through Charleston that even the thick summer air could not muffle. In a city accustomed to the spectacle of human misery, this was something altogether new, a slave who had outwitted the men who owned the world around him. The authorities, unsure whether to treat him as man or property, chained him in the city jail on Magazine Street, a damp brick labyrinth where voices echoed like confessions. Word of his crimes spread with morbid fascination. The Charleston. Mercury described him as the black healer of death, a man of unnatural intellect and cold precision. Others whispered his name like a curse, afraid that even speaking it might summon him. But among the enslaved, Solomon's story traveled differently, not as horror, but as myth. A whisper passed through the quarters, carried by candlelight and prayer. He didn't kill 9 men. He taught them what it feels like to be buried alive. The courtroom of contradictions. On September the 2nd, 1853, the trial began in Charleston's Grand Courthouse on Meeting Street, the same street where Solomon had once tended the sick. Now he stood in iron shackles before men whose ancestors had built their fortunes on his people's chains. The presiding judge was Edward Mallory, a man of stern reputation and unshakable faith in the law, at least the law as Charleston wrote it. The prosecutor, Charles Rutledge, delivered his opening remarks with righteous fury. "This man," Rutledge thundered, "has violated the divine order of civilization. He took the gift of knowledge bestowed upon him by his master and turned it into an instrument of vengeance. If this be allowed, then every dark mind in bondage will dream of revolt." In the gallery, murmurs of fear rippled through Charleston's elite. The words, "every dark mind," lingered like a storm cloud over their heads. When the defense rose, the courtroom fell into a strange hush. Benjamin Crawford, a reluctant attorney appointed by the court, was known for his polished manners and his discomfort with controversy. Yet when he spoke, his voice carried an edge of conviction no one expected. "I do not deny my client's actions," he began. "But I ask this court to look upon the world that made him. What law protects a man whose wife is left to die by the roadside? What justice defends a father as his children are sold like cattle? You call him murderer. I call him the mirror of your own cruelty." The judge pounded his gavel. "Counsel will restrain himself." But Crawford continued, "If Solomon Fairfax is guilty, then so is every man who has ever profited from the trade that destroyed his family. This court demands he die for seeking justice, yet the men who forced him to it are buried with honor under church bells." For a moment, even the walls seemed to hold their breath. The witnesses of the living dead. Then came the testimony that froze Charleston's blood. The 6 men who had survived Solomon's final act, the paralyzed victims from the Henderson offices, were carried into court, pale and trembling. Their accounts were recorded in detail. Colonel Harrison Vance, voice shaking, described the horror of being declared dead while fully aware. "I heard them pronounce me gone. I heard my wife's sobs. I felt the lid close. And when the dirt hit the coffin, I could taste it. The dust through my nose, the pressure in my chest. I screamed inside myself until the world went black." Another victim, Judge Landon Price, wept openly on the stand. "I thought I was in hell, and when they dug me up, when I could breathe again, I prayed for death instead." The court listened in stunned silence. Even the prosecutor faltered, sensing the shift in the air. These men were not testifying to mere murder. They were confessing to the terror of experiencing what they had inflicted on others for generations. Complete helplessness. When Solomon was asked if he had anything to say in response, he lifted his head, eyes steady, voice quiet but unyielding. "I gave them hours to understand what a lifetime feels like in chains." The courtroom erupted. Gasps, cries, outrage. The judge ordered silence, but the words had already settled over everyone like ash, the journalist and the journal throughout. The proceedings, Thomas Grimby sat in the front row, notebook in hand, his pen scratching furiously across each page. He had seen the truth up close, the calculated calm, the eyes that held no madness but infinite clarity. After Solomon's arrest, Grimby had been allowed to read portions of the Healer's journal, now in the custody of the court. What he found left him sleepless for weeks. "They burned my life to pay their debts." I learned to mix compounds that still the body, but leave the soul awake. I have turned their science inward, so that justice may breathe through knowledge. Grimby's articles electrified the South. His prose walked the line between horror and admiration, and his description of Solomon as a man made monstrous by the laws that enslaved him drew both praise and condemnation. Plantation owners demanded his dismissal. Abolitionist papers in the North reprinted his words as proof that slavery was a moral rot poisoning the nation. Charleston found itself under a microscope it could not bear. The sentence on October 15, 1853, after 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. Guilty. The decision surprised no one. What did surprise them was the serenity with which Solomon received it. When asked if he had any final statement, he spoke with the same measured tone he had used when mixing his medicines. "You call me murderer because I refused to die quietly. I was trained to heal, but your world gave me nothing to heal but suffering. You took my family and called it commerce. You took my silence and called it obedience. I took your knowledge and called it justice." He paused, looking toward the gallery where his surviving victims sat pale as ghosts. "I have no hate left, only the wish that when you bury me you listen closely. For in the silence beneath the earth you may still hear those who were never allowed to speak." Even Judge Mallory, who prided himself on stoicism, looked away. The hanging at dawn, the gallows were raised behind the Charleston jail. Over 2,000 people gathered, planters in broad hats, house servants forced to watch, and even curious children perched on shoulders. The crowd buzzed with fascination and fear, a carnival of hypocrisy dressed as justice. When Solomon was brought out, chains clinking against the wood, he looked neither defeated nor defiant. His calm unsettled the crowd more than any outburst could have. Grimby, standing near the front, recorded every word. The executioner asked if he had any last prayer. Solomon lifted his head toward the pale morning sky. "I die knowing 9 men felt the terror my children felt, and that is enough. But mark my words, this system will birth others like me again and again, until justice is no longer a luxury reserved for the powerful." The trapdoor fell. The rope swung. Charleston exhaled, not in relief, but in guilt. The legend, buried Solomon's body, was denied burial within city limits. He was placed in an unmarked grave outside Charleston, the final indignity of a life defined by injustice. But his journal, the same one written under candlelight in the room above Meeting Street, vanished from the courthouse archives before sentencing was carried out. Grimby, who had copied its contents by hand, wrote a final note years later. "I buried the original beneath the Magnolia tree in St. Michael's Cemetery, beside the men he condemned. Let it rest where truth belongs, between the righteous and the damned." The echo long after the headlines faded, the story of Solomon Fairfax refused to die. His name was whispered by field hands in secret, by nurses tending the sick, by students of medicine who found the tale both fascinating and horrifying. And decades later, when gravediggers uncovered 9 coffins with claw marks on the inside, Charleston's silence broke for good. The city sealed the files. The churches prayed for peace. But under the Magnolia tree, the roots still curled around. A small leather-bound book that told a different story, the story of a man who refused to let the world forget what it had done to him. When the noose snapped and the crowd gasped, Thomas Grimby lowered his pen. He had written the final line before it happened, as if the ending had already been printed somewhere older than paper. "Justice cannot hang from a rope." But the key, image of Solomon Fairfax, calm and silent in death, would not leave him. For weeks afterward, Grimby wandered Charleston streets at night, haunted by what he had witnessed. In every alley and flickering lamplight, he saw the shadow of the healer who had become a killer, or perhaps a prophet. He tried to convince himself he had done his duty. His articles had made him famous, his newspaper richer than ever. But fame has a voice, and sometimes that voice whispers when a man is alone. You recorded his death, not his truth. The weight of words in the months following the execution, Charleston tried to bury its fear beneath sermons and social calls. Yet the story of Solomon Fairfax spread far beyond the city's borders. Northern newspapers reprinted Grimby's serialized reports under headlines like The Healer's Revenge and Murder in the Name of Justice. Readers devoured every line, the poisoned medicine, the paralysis, the burials. But they missed what Grimby now understood too well, that the story wasn't about how Solomon killed, but why. He began keeping a second journal, one he never intended for publication. In its pages, his tone shifted from the detached language of a reporter to the guilt of a man complicit in something sacred and terrible. October 15th. The crowd cheered when he fell. I did not. I felt only silence, as if the air itself refused to breathe. Perhaps I am not merely a witness. Perhaps I am the next link in the chain he began. He found himself returning to the jail, to the courthouse, to every place Solomon's feet had touched in those final days. He even visited Dr. Hathaway, now a broken man who had shuttered his practice. The old doctor sat by an empty fireplace, hands shaking from the arthritis that Solomon had once eased. "He was the best assistant I ever had," Hathaway muttered. "If I'd known his pain, perhaps I could have healed it." Grimby said nothing. He knew that was a lie. Some wounds do not close. They only learn to hide beneath the skin. The Journal of the Dead. In late autumn of 1853, weeks after Solomon's execution, a court clerk summoned Grimby to retrieve his notes. The city planned to seal the records permanently, labeling them a matter of civic sensitivity. But one item was missing: Solomon's original leather journal. The clerk swore it had been in the evidence chest until the morning after the execution. No one knew where it had gone. Grimby did. He remembered that night after the verdict, when the courthouse emptied and the moon turned the courtroom floor to silver. He had lingered by the evidence table, staring at the worn leather book that had condemned its author. The temptation had been unbearable. A story like this belonged not to the city but to history. He took it, and with it he took a burden that would consume the rest of his life. The man beneath the Magnolia's years passed. The war came and went, tearing down the world that had enslaved millions. Charleston burned, rebuilt, and tried to forget. Grimby did not. He aged into solitude, living in a house near the cemetery whose soil still hid the secrets of 9 restless men. By 1889, his hair had turned white, his eyesight dim, but his mind still carried every word Solomon had ever written. He began drafting his final manuscript, a confession rather than a report. In its preface he wrote, "I once believed my duty was to record the truth. I now know my duty was to protect it." He recounted the conversation he and Solomon had shared that night at Henderson and Associates, the moment when justice and journalism had stared one another in the eye. He described how Solomon had refused escape, insisting that truth required witnesses. "If I flee, they will forget," he told me. "If I die, they will remember. Even if they lie about me, they will speak my name." Grimby's pen trembled as he transcribed those words again, decades later. They had proved prophetic. He closed his memoir with a single final act, one last deceit meant to preserve a greater honesty. On the night of August 14, 1889, Grimby carried Solomon's original journal through St. Michael's Cemetery, the moon high above the oak branches. He stopped beneath the massive Magnolia, whose roots wound between the graves of the men Solomon had condemned. There he dug a shallow hole and placed the journal inside. "You said justice must be seen," he whispered to the earth. "Let it sleep where their bones lie. Let future generations decide what justice truly is." He sealed the ground with his hands and left without looking back. The confession, Grimby's own journal, the confession, was found in his study after his death in 1890, beside his empty inkwell. In it were the words that historians would one day call the journalist's testament. "I did not expose Solomon Fairfax. I completed him. My words gave him breath beyond the grave. If that is sin, then I accept it. For sometimes truth demands 2 men, one to act and one to tell the world why." He never married. He never published the confession. His editors, upon finding it, locked the manuscript in a private archive. For decades it gathered dust, until 1923, when workers renovating St. Michael's Cemetery unearthed the Magnolia roots and the scratched coffins below. The city sealed the discovery, calling it an unfortunate disturbance. But among the workers was a young archivist named Elias Brandt, who later wrote in a private letter, "We found a book buried beneath the tree. The name inside was Solomon Fairfax. I think Charleston buried its conscience that day." The book vanished again into official silence, the same silence that had tried and failed to bury Solomon himself. The ghost in the ledger Charleston moved forward, but history does not forget its own handwriting. Grimby's confession, when rediscovered decades later, painted the full picture. A healer turned executioner, a journalist turned witness, and a city forced to confront its reflection in their shared guilt. Every act of cruelty leaves a ledger. Solomon wrote his in ink, Grimby wrote his in ink mixed with shame, and together they created something no gallows could silence, a record of what happens when justice starves too long and begins to hunger in return. By the spring of 1923, Charleston had learned to live with its ghosts. The war had passed, the Reconstruction years had faded into silence, and the city once again looked proud beneath its canopy of oaks and church spires. Tourists walked the cobblestones, admiring wrought-iron gates and stories of gallantry, the kind of stories that polished tragedy into charm. But history, no matter how carefully painted over, has a way of blooming back through the soil. And that year it did so beneath the wide, low branches of the oldest Magnolia in St. Michael's Cemetery. The renovation, the city had approved a large restoration project that spring. Decades of hurricanes and flooding had left graves sunken and stones tilted, their inscriptions fading beneath moss and neglect. A team of laborers and surveyors began work in early May, clearing overgrowth and repairing burial walls. When they reached the northern edge of the cemetery, they found the Magnolia, immense, ancient. Its roots coiled like sleeping serpents over the graves of Charleston's 9 honored sons. Each of those marble markers bore a familiar name to anyone who had studied local history: Fitzpatrick, Calverton, Dandridge, Vance, Monroe, Price, Devo, Abner, Cray, the men who had died mysteriously in the 1850s. The foreman, John McIntyre, noted how oddly the ground had settled there. "Like the earth's been disturbed more than once," he muttered. When one of the laborers struck wood while leveling the soil, the sound was not of a coffin at rest. It was of something hollow, wrong, the unearthed. They opened the first grave at noon. The coffin's lid crumbled at the touch, releasing a stale breath of trapped centuries. Inside, what they saw sent 2 men running from the site. The corpse was twisted, its hands curled upward, fingers broken and splintered. The inside of the lid was gouged with deep claw marks, as though the occupant had awoken and fought until his nails tore away. At first, they thought it an isolated horror, but the second coffin told the same story. And the third. By the 9th, no one spoke at all. Each body bore the same expression: mouths open in silent screams, arms contorted, backs arched. The horror was so uniform it looked deliberate, ritualistic. Someone had meant for them to die this way. City officials were summoned at once. The Charleston Board of Preservation ordered the area sealed, the workers silenced, the graves recovered before sunset. "Disturbing our city's resting fathers will do no good," one councilman said. "Let the past stay decent." But rumors spread like fire through dry grass. Within days, the newspapers caught wind of it. The Charleston Herald ran a small, quickly censored headline: "Strange findings beneath the Magnolias, were the city's elders buried alive." The issue was pulled from stands within hours. The Hidden Journal 3 nights later, as the workers prepared to abandon the site, one of them, a young archivist named Elias Brandt, returned alone. Something about the graves unsettled him, not just because of the bodies, but because the Magnolia itself seemed to guard them, its roots woven through the coffins like a living sentinel. By lantern light, Brandt knelt at the base of the tree and noticed a small cavity between the roots. Inside, wrapped in decaying leather, was a book. The pages were water-stained, the ink faded, but the handwriting was unmistakably refined. Deliberate. The first line he read froze him where he knelt. "Today I watched my wife and children burn, and I did nothing to stop it." The next page began with a date, March 15, 1851, Elias read through the night. the story of a healer turned avenger, a man who used knowledge to repay cruelty with precision. There were entries describing the 9 men, the formula for the paralytic compound, the careful notes on dosage and effect. He realized then what he was holding, the lost journal of Solomon Fairfax. At dawn, he brought it to the office of Dr. Lydia Haynes, a historian at the College of Charleston. She examined it, her face pale. "If this is genuine," she said, "it's the most dangerous book in this city." The cover-up by week's end, the mayor's office had taken custody of both the book and the excavation site. Workers were dismissed, records sealed. The official statement released to the press read simply, "During scheduled maintenance, old graves were found in advanced decay. No unusual findings of historical importance." Behind closed doors, however, the journal was labeled Classified Archive 1923A and locked in the city's subterranean vault, where it was said to have remained for decades, but not before Elias Brandt copied key passages by hand. His notes, found years later among his belongings, contained this chilling excerpt. "Justice is patient, but it is also certain. I have buried them alive not out of cruelty, but out of truth. Let their souls wander as mine was forced to. Let the earth remember what men choose to forget." Brandt's handwriting below that line reads, "If this is true, Charleston was built over the graves of its own sins, and its roots still drink from them. The tree that would not die by autumn." Strange stories began to circulate among the cemetery caretakers. Some claimed that the magnolia bloomed out of season, its flowers opening even in December. Others said they heard scratching sounds beneath the soil when the wind blew. One caretaker swore he saw fingerprints in the fresh bark of the tree, as though someone beneath had pressed upward from the earth. The city dismissed these tales as superstition. Yet they quietly fenced off that section of the cemetery and posted guards after dark. Those who knew whispered that Charleston had learned its lesson. Some truths cannot be exhumed without consequence. The historian's letter in 1947, Dr. Lydia Haynes, then retired, wrote a letter to the Charleston Historical Society, sealed to be opened 50 years after her death. When it was unsealed in 1997, it contained only 3 short paragraphs and a photograph of the magnolia tree. "I saw the Fairfax journal. I read every page. It was not madness. It was method, and grief turned into science. The men he punished were not innocent. The city has spent 70 years hiding what it cannot forgive. They called him a monster, but monsters are made by those who think suffering belongs to others. Solomon did not destroy Charleston, he revealed it. The tree still blooms every winter. That is not a curse, it is remembrance. The return a century later, the magnolia still stands. Its blossoms fall like pale ghosts onto the graves below. Tourists pass by, unaware of the history sleeping beneath their feet. The city plaques mention none of it, but on quiet nights when the moon glints off the old iron gate, caretakers say you can still hear faint scratching beneath the soil, not of terror, but of persistence. The sound of a man reminding the living that justice never stays buried. A century and a half after his execution, Solomon Fairfax remains both a ghost and a mirror, a reminder that the past never dies quietly. His name, once buried by Charleston's elite, has surfaced again and again in whispers, legends, and footnotes that refuse to fade. Today, historians, theologians, and moral philosophers debate the same question Charleston's courts tried to silence in 1853. Was Solomon Fairfax a murderer, or the first man in the South to force justice upon an unjust world? The unfinished justice in the decades following the 1923 discovery, the Fairfax story became something between folklore and forbidden truth. Professors discussed it in closed classrooms. Ministers warned against dwelling on wicked vengeance. Yet quietly, scholars began to publish fragments, chemistry notes, trial transcripts, even Grimby's confession, retrieved from the dust of forgotten archives. The narrative that emerged was not one of madness, but of cause and consequence. Solomon had taken the tools of his oppressors, medicine, literacy, patience, and turned them into weapons sharper than any blade. His victims had wielded the law to destroy families. He wielded knowledge to make the law tremble. Charleston's institutions tried to frame his story as tragedy, but to those who read between the lines, it was revelation. The journal returns in 1971 during the Civil Rights Movement. A young historian named Dr. Miriam DeVoe ironically descended from one of Solomon's 9 victims, uncovered a near-complete copy of Fairfax's journal among the private papers of Thomas Grimby's estate. She described, opening the brittle pages in her memoir, "It was not the work of a madman. It was the work of a man documenting truth in a language too civilized for the world that enslaved him." Her publication, The Healer's Justice, reignited the debate. Newspapers across the South revisited the story. Churches split in opinion. Some called Solomon a moral monster. Others called him a prophet of reckoning. Protesters carried signs quoting his final words, "Even the most patient man has limits." The City Council of Charleston, under mounting public pressure, authorized a small plaque to be placed in St. Michael's Cemetery in 1974. It bore no names, only a single sentence carved into stone. "Here lies the memory of what the earth refused to forget." The scientific legacy, unintentionally, Solomon Fairfax also shaped the evolution of American medicine. The compound he developed, a paralytic agent derived from a South American vine, inspired forensic researchers to develop new toxin detection methods. His crimes led to the foundation of Charleston's first toxicology laboratory in 1855. 2 years after his execution, medical historians now acknowledge that his understanding of pharmacology predated formal research on neuromuscular blockers by nearly a century. In quiet academic circles, his name is sometimes invoked as the uncredited chemist of the Carolina lowlands. To some, that fact feels like justice, knowledge surviving where its possessor could not. The tree in the city, the Magnolia tree, still stands. Despite hurricanes, fires, and floods, its roots clutch the soil of 9 men who once owned the city's conscience. Visitors often remark that its blossoms carry a strange sweetness, heavy, almost intoxicating, blooming twice a year instead of once. Locals say it's Solomon's tree. They say when the wind moves through it, the branches sound like whispering, as if someone were still reading a list of names. Each year, a handful of students from the College of Charleston leave flowers there. No ceremony, no speeches. Just petals for the man who proved that silence, when weaponized, could be louder than any sermon. The last entry in 2019, restoration crews cleaning the cemetery's northern wall discovered something embedded in the Magnolia's roots, a rusted tin box. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the ink faint but legible. Forensic analysis confirmed it was written in the same hand as Solomon's journal. It contained only one sentence: "Justice sleeps, but it never dies." The end that wasn't Charleston's museums now tell the story carefully, the Fairfax affair, as they call it, with measured tones and neutral words. But those who read deeply know that it was never an affair. It was a reckoning. Solomon Fairfax's life ended on a rope, yet his story endures, not as vengeance glorified but as truth remembered. His journal, his knowledge, and his defiance all ask the same question that still echoes beneath the Magnolia's roots. When the law becomes the crime, what is justice? And though centuries have passed, the earth beneath St. Michael's still seems to whisper the answer. Soft, unending, and certain, justice is patient.